Welcome back to Origins. This is your friendly host Mel. You can find me on a multiple set of channels. There's Rumble and YouTube, where I'm making all my new videos. So take your pick. Perhaps it'd be a good idea to subscribe to both of them, just in case I have to take down my YouTube channel in the future, or YouTube takes me down. And if you want to catch up on all the old videos, you can move over to Odyssey, and all the videos that are made under the name Sneakers Corner are contained there. So I would suggest a good idea to hit the subscribe button now, just in case you miss future videos and you can't find the channel. With that out of the way, we're continuing with part 3 of this short series on AJ Deus's paper, The Jewish Serpent King in the Dome of the Rock. Now, over the course of these 3 parts, we've exposed the fact that there are multiple holes in the narrative in relation to the Dome of the Rock. There is, in fact, 7 holes. Our earliest reference to a Dome of the Rock, i.e. a dome over the Temple Mount foundation rock, is in the late 9th century, and we discover that in part 2. Our earliest verifiable witness to the Dome of the Rock mosaics and the inner arcade inscriptions as they exist today is 1523 to 1543 AD. The earliest witness inscription as to who built the dome was from 1523 to 1543 AD, and it said Umar built it. The earliest verifiable date for the creation of Abd Al Malik inscription is 1720 to 1744 AD. Complete rebuilding of the drum from the ground up, from octagonal to circular, that was done in the mid-18th century. The mosaics and inscriptions on the drum and the dome are 18th century creations. The earliest verifiable date for the creation of the Al-Mamun correction is sometime between 817 and 1833 AD. So, as you can see, there's amazing, gigantic holes coming up, and just make sure that at the end of this video you don't forget to share this video with your people. Okay, here we go. So we need to know when the mosaics and inscriptions were, at least verifiably, first witnessed to. The inscriptions are on the inner arcade, and to be authentic need to have been created in the 7th century and survived the 13th centuries that followed unscathed. Remarkably, as if by miracle, the only recognizable change has been the replacement of Abd Al Malik's name with Al-Mamun. We can't just assume on faith that the purported 7th century artifacts are genuine. There ought to exist corroborating evidence. Is that too much to ask for? So, continuing with our evidence then, part 3. The Persian Nasir visits the site in 1047 AD. Nasir identified the dedication of Al-Mamun on one of these gates, but not in the Dome of the Rock. From the interior, he merely mentions the unique woodwork for ceiling and roofing. He also provides for a detailed account of removable interior decorations and the supernatural rock itself. He is silent about mosaics and inscriptions. Why would he not mention these? So we're talking 3 centuries after Abd al Malik's time, and there is no inscriptions where we would expect to find them, which is in the inner arcade. The only ones that he mentions are those on the gates. Okay, so what we're going to see today a lot of is the fact that there is complete confusion about who exactly built the Dome of the Rock. And the reason for this confusion is highly likely due to the fact that the Dome of the Rock was rebuilt many times over the centuries, and so it's really hard to ascribe an original builder of it. And so the people that they're going to suggest would be Umar, Abd Al Malik and Al-Mamun, but they can't make up their mind which it is. Okay, 1322 AD, witness describes dramatically different dimensions from the current Dome of the Rock. John Mandeville has supposedly been in Jerusalem around 1322. He testifies to having personally witnessed the Muslim rituals in the Dome of the Rock and describes the building as simple, just as commanded in the Bible, which would not be simple but richly decorated. It was twice as high as wide, the dominant exterior feature being marble pillars all round. Now, in case you didn't catch that, his description of the Dome of the Rock being twice as high as wide is incredibly different to what it is today. So that should flag something important there, that the Dome of the Rock has been transformed over the centuries in a dramatic way. So the Dome of the Rock today is not twice as high as it is wide, but about 3/4 high as it is wide. So for it to be twice as high originally, it would have had to be more like a tower in the center rather than simply a dome. And AJ Deus goes on to say, but try to draw the geometry of what was just said. Given that the outer octagonal is documented, we are now looking at a sizable tower, double the height of the current structure. No one seems to see the mosaics or the inscriptions. The Andalusian jurist Ibn al-Arabi visited the Dome of the Rock around 1092 to 95 AD, but leaves no description of Abd Al Malik's mosaics or inscriptions. So Ibn al-Arabi obviously can speak Arabic. He would have been able to read them if they were there. He would have likely have found them significant and worth noting, and yet he leaves no description of them. He makes no comment about them. They're just simply not mentioned. That's very strange. The most plausible explanation is simply that they didn't exist. If you want to maintain the position that they did exist, but he just simply didn't mention them, you're going to have to put up a pretty good argument for why that would be the case, and we can't just assume that they existed. See, the difference here is we're not just accepting things on faith simply because they exist today and assuming that they existed back then. We need evidence, so we need to actually have a witness that actually says, yes, these existed in this year, I was there. But as we can see, we still haven't seen anyone witness to them, and it's now the 11th century. Now, 1106, 1107 AD, we have the first mention of the interior mosaics, or at least some interior mosaics. It may not be the ones that exist today. The Russian abbot Daniel visited the Holy Land in 1106, 1107 and left detailed descriptions that include the first mention of interior mosaics. While this is the first such description from shortly after the Crusaders had captured Jerusalem, it is too general an overview, and it does not mention the all-important inscriptions. Now, a little bit later, we are actually going to detail inscriptions that were found in the Dome of the Rock not long after this, but it isn't what you would expect. Now, an interesting curiosity, from the early 1100s, we have the church of the Santo Sapolcro in Pisa, called the Mosque of Omar. Now, bit of a strange one. Why was it called Santo Sapolcro? So it's in relation to the Holy Sepulchre, but notice it's called the Mosque of Omar. So why is that? Well, at that time it was believed that the tomb of Jesus was kept on the Temple Mount. Okay. The church is called Santo Sapolcro because it was designed as a smaller copy of Jesus Christ's burial place at the time under the rock of the Mosque of Omar. Now, what's fascinating for me is a few months ago I argued that the crypt under the Dome of the Rock is consistent with it being a sepulchre for Muhammad. Now, I threw that idea out for lack of evidence, but this here is kind of new evidence for me that kind of reinforces that, except what do we have here? It's not Muhammad but Jesus. But of course, if you've been following Thomas Alexander's videos, you will know the connection between the idea of Muhammad and Jesus, in that Muhammad was being used as an alternative word for Jesus in those early centuries, and hence a lot of the confusion. The design of Santo Sapolcro is an octagonal drum on an octagonal main building. So why is that a problem? Well, simply because if this is copying what the Dome of the Rock was like at that time, the drum that is in the Dome of the Rock today, which is the central part directly under the dome, it's not octagonal but circular today. So that means that there's been a fundamental rebuild from the foundation up. So that's a pretty massive change. But if it is supposed to be a miniature replica of the Dome of the Rock, one needs to wonder why it would sport an octagonal drum. Now, I totally get why some people might reject this and say, well, this is not sufficient evidence to prove that the drum in the Dome of the Rock at that time was octagonal. We are going to provide evidence for that, just to confirm that this is a correct inference here. So when we speak about the fact that there was an octagonal drum and that there's a circular one today, why is this a problem? Well, you can see here the bird's eye view is what it looks like today. As you can see, it's circular. There's a picture on the right. You can clearly see the circular nature of it. These are not octagonal faces on the inner part of the Dome of the Rock. This is clearly circular. So this inner part is the drum, as we've said. Now, an image of what the Dome of the Rock, the Temple of Solomon, looked like in the 12th century. So this is excellent evidence. This is a coin from Amalric I, and it's thought to show the city of Jerusalem around 1163 to 1174. It lines up with the Holy Sepulchre, the Tower of David, and the Temple of Solomon. The reverse of a lead seal by Baldwin IV shows the same symbolism, although mirrored right. So which one is the Dome of the Rock at that time? It's the one that is being pointed to in both cases with the red arrow. And as you can see, it's not so much a dome at that time, but it's hard really to describe what it is. It's more like I suppose maybe an acorn maybe, and you can just make out, it's almost like a bullhorn on the top, but it's a crescent moon on the top of it. So we can see there it's significantly different at that time. So the drum is octagonal. Here is another depiction of it here. This is from a seal by Baldwin III, 1143, 1163, and by John of Brienne. In the latter case, the Dome of the Rock is crowned with a crescent moon, which may be present in the earlier versions also. So if you look at the image on the right hand side, that's what is being referred to. And you can see there it's not really a dome, it's more like an acorn with a crescent moon on the top. Okay. The design of these seals is not detailed enough to provide for clues other than the apparent cone shape of the cupola that rests on a tower-like main building that appears to be crowned by a ring of arcades. It is slightly taller than wide. A priest, Johann from Würzburg in Germany, confirms the above decorations in the 1160s. He also delivers a detailed observation of the exterior and interior of the Dome of the Rock. The most stunning mosaic work was at the upper part of the walls, where each of the 8 sides has 5 windows, except 4 on the sides with the doors, 36 in total. A more elevated and narrower inner wall is completely round with 12 windows. So AJ Deus goes on to say, let me put emphasis on its unclear description. The upper part of the walls were octagonal with 5 windows each, and the more elevated and narrower inner wall was round with 12 windows. This matches the modern appearance vaguely. So Johann in the 1160s, the same Johann just mentioned, notes alternative, likely Crusader era inscriptions. So how come we haven't heard about these inscriptions before? Because obviously they were destroyed in the meantime. he says, under the roof outside to the west, it says, eternal peace be to this house from the eternal Father. Blessed be the glory of the Lord from his holy place. Does that sound like an Islamic inscription to you? Clearly Crusader. He says, to the south, the house of the Lord is well founded upon a firm rock. Blessed are they that dwell in your house, forever and ever will they praise you. To the east, truly the Lord is in that place, and I knew it not. In your house, Lord, all will say glory. To the north, the temple of the Lord is holy. It is God's culture, it is God's building. Inside, in the upper line all round, there is added in large letters the following reply, Hear, Sir, hymn. In the lower circuit also, with golden letters, certain verses of that hymn, Jerusalem, the blessed city, are attached. Now, I can't confirm or deny whether the tomb of Jesus at that time was being stored under the Dome of the Rock, but it is clearly a Christian inscription at that time. So, in order for there to be something else there, at the very least, those areas in the Dome of the Rock would have had to have these inscriptions removed and replaced by something else, and yet there's no acknowledgement of the fact that those mosaics must be from after this period. You know, we're being told that these mosaics are pretty much original, all these inscriptions, these dedications that we see today, but this is offering us a challenge to that, really. Now, in the 1170s, Theodoricus, another German and possibly Johann's friend, visits Jerusalem about 10 years later. He also notes the inscriptions in almost identical detail. He describes another mosaic work that seems to be a decoration of an internal structure, and he provides an additional inscription, but there's no mention of the supposed Abd Al Malik inscription. Instead, he reports this. The inscription reads, over the ark of the choir, my house is called the house of prayer, says the Lord. In it whoever asks receives, and whoever asks finds, and it will be open to him who knocks. Ask and be affectionate, seek and find. So that's clearly a Christian inscription. In the upper circle, it says, Hear, sir, the hymn and the prayer which your servant prays before you, my Lord, that your eyes may be open and your ears attentive over this house day and night. Look down, O Lord, from your sanctuary and from the highest habitation of heaven. And then he also mentions various places like Antioch, Jerusalem, and so on. He also further notes a commemorative inscription regarding Jacob, but nothing about Abd Al Malik, nothing about Al-Mamun, and there's no reference to the Arabic inscription about Jesus and Muhammad. Okay, so that's suspicious. Now, you could argue he couldn't speak Arabic and that's why he doesn't mention it, but we're going to see that that's not a good enough explanation. Benjamin of Tudela is told this time that Umar built the Dome of the Rock. He visits the Temple Mount around 1171 AD. He says Jerusalem has 4 gates: the gate of Abraham, the gate of David, the gate of Zion, and the gate of Gushpat, which is the gate of Jehoshaphat, facing our ancient temple now called Templin Domini. Upon the site of the sanctuary, Omar bin al-Khattab erected an edifice with a very large and magnificent cupola, into which the Gentiles do not bring any image or effigy, but they merely come there to pray. So you see, the claim is now that Omar built the Dome of the Rock, and who could blame him for thinking that if there was no inscription there? If there was an inscription there, he would know that. There should have been people around that would have been aware of earlier stories of it being Abd Al Malik or Al-Mamun, if there was an inscription in relation to that, but it doesn't seem to be. Now, Ali doesn't mention the inscriptions up high. A few years before the reconquest of Jerusalem by Saladin, Ali of Herat provides for substantially altered measurements the Dome of the Rock in its current external state of architectural dimensions. This opens a window for upgrades to the extant structural appearance in the Dome of the Rock from between 1033 to 1187 AD. Most likely they fall into the patronage of the Crusaders. Ali of Herat did not overlook artistic works elsewhere. For example, he describes how beneath the rock was enamelled work all round, but not inscriptions or mosaics up high. Why does he not mention those? If he's well capable of describing artistic works, say, below the Dome of the Rock, why does he not mention them right above his head? Instead, Ali describes Quranic verses in gilded mosaics above the entrances. There's a quote there that he gives. So he could see Quranic verses above the entrances. He can see mosaics and other artistic works down beneath the rock, but he doesn't see anything above his head. Why not? While European travellers could be excused for being disinterested in Muslim art or their inability to read it, with Ali we have evidence of absence. He could not and would not have overlooked these inscriptions and mosaics, and he would certainly have reported them if they existed. I think the argument is really strong that they mustn't have existed yet. And also, bear in mind that in addition to this is the fact that people don't know who built the Dome of the Rock. They're saying Umar, they're saying Abd Al Malik, they're saying Al Mamun, they're saying Walid. They don't seem to have a clue who did it. If there was an inscription there, they would at least be able to say, well, it's either Abd Al Malik or Al Mamun based on the year 72 AH, if that was there. So they would say, well, maybe it was started by Abd Al Malik and Al Mamun finished it, but we don't even have that kind of reduction of the possibilities. There seems to be 4 contenders there. Imad ad-Din doesn't mention any sign of the inscriptions late in the 12th century. Under the patronage of Saladin, Imad ad-Din describes the interior of the Dome of the Rock, leaving the presence of mosaics and inscriptions out. So here's what he says. They had adorned it with images and statues, set up dwellings there for monks, and made it the place for the gospel, which they venerated and exalted to the heights. Over the place of the prophet's holy foot they set an ornamented tabernacle with columns of marble, marking it as the place where the Messiah had set his foot. Now notice that the Crusaders consider it to be the place where Jesus set his foot, whereas in Muslim traditions they say it was Muhammad. This was where Muhammad set his foot. So do you see again this ambiguity between Jesus and Muhammad that seems to reoccur? A holy and exalted place where flocks of animals, among which I saw species of pig, were carved in marble. You can imagine how that went down for the Muslims when they reconquered the Dome of the Rock. The late 13th century, still no mention of the mosaics or inscriptions. So we're getting quite late, and it's surprising. If these inscriptions existed, they should have been at least mentioned by now. The Mamluk as Zahir Baybars seems to have commissioned a restoration of the building and the external mosaics between 1260 and 1277 AD, and the Mamluk Sultan of Egypt, Muhammad ibn Kalaun, orders another restoration of the mosaics and adds his commemorative inscription in 1318-1319 AD. During his reign, the south wall of Al-Aqsa is also built or rebuilt, but there is still no extant description of mosaics and inscriptions. Now we turn to Ibn Taymiyyah, the 14th century. He says that it was Abd Al Malik who built a dome over the rock. See, we've changed again. It was Umar a while ago, now it's Abd Al Malik. So it was Abd Al Malik who built a dome over the rock during his reign, following the civil war that broke out between him and Ibn az-Zubair. It is sometimes said that some people sought to perform the pilgrimage and joined Ibn az-Zubair, or that they used the pilgrimage as a pretext to join Ibn az-Zubayr. AJ Deus comments, "It is puzzling that Ibn Taymiyyah is so sure about the builder, given that an alleged interior inscription would say otherwise. He does not say the dome, but a dome. Does he perhaps know that the dome of the rock as it stands before him is not the one that had originally been built?" He goes on to say, and this is again Ibn Taymiyyah, "By erecting a structure over it, Abd Al Malik increased the reverence for the rock and held it covered throughout the year. As we saw in the earlier evidence, the evidence is contrary to this, that it wasn't covered at the time of Abd Al Malik. It was exposed, unless we're talking about that tower. There's an image of a tower that's in the Sana manuscript, but certainly between the time of Abd Al Malik and 2 centuries later, around that period, there seems to be conflicting reports, some saying that there was only one building on the Temple Mount and that it was north of the rock. So there's definitely a question mark. It's not certain that there was a building over the rock. It's a confused situation. And he also says that he covered it throughout the year so that growing numbers should flock to Beit al-Maqdis for pilgrimage. That seems reasonable. But the idea that, and be deflected thereby from going to Ibn az-Zubayr, perhaps it's not in that order. Perhaps he's inverting what actually happened. So instead of it being a diversion from going down to Mecca or wherever, perhaps it started there and then at a later time things moved on to Mecca as an alternative to Jerusalem. He goes on to say, "People follow the religion of their king. It was since that time that veneration of the rock and Beit al-Maqdis assumed a proportion hitherto unknown among the believers." He seems to be suggesting that there is still a veneration of the rock, and that it kind of grew over time, and that before that time this was unknown among the believers. But I would say that's wrong. The veneration of the rock goes all the way back to Jewish times, so I think he's twisting the narrative quite a bit here, even though it looks plausible and reasonable. Again, in 1355 AD, Ibn Battuta mentions interior ornaments but no dedicatory inscriptions. Another description from 1355 notes interior ornaments with gilding and colours. Even though we expect the presence of dedicatory inscriptions, he mentions none of them, including Al-Mamun's. In 1448, the roof of the dome is destroyed by a fire and restored by Sultan Al-Malik al-Zahir. One would again need to take the unlikely position that the mosaics and inscriptions, should they have existed, remained undamaged and needed no repairs after the fire. So that's what we're being expected to believe. The current mosaics have no signs of fire damage, no buckling, no replacement of mosaics beyond the Al-Mamun one. It's highly unlikely that a fire that would have spread across the roof directly above the arcades could somehow not have damaged those mosaics. It beggars belief. Now, we also have some evidence that the roof was onion shaped for a time, and we can see that the drum is octagonal, so there's our confirmation that we were talking about earlier. This is from approximately the 1420s. The Three Marys at the Tomb is a panel painting from around 1410 to 1426 AD, or perhaps 1440. It is attributed to Hubert van Eyck or his workshop. He designed an onion-shaped dome, a crowned octagonal drum with 3 double-arched windows on each side and 6 window openings on each of the main building's sides. The modern balustrades around the main structure's roof are missing. Okay, so we see 2 significant differences between what it was then and what it is now. Abd Al Malik not mentioned in relation to the Dome of the Rock. Instead, this time it's Umar. So you remember Ibn Taymiyyah had said that it was Abd Al Malik. Well, a little bit later, it's Umar again. Around 1453, the Ottoman Sufi Sheikh Ahmed Yazisi Oglu, apologies for my pronunciation, claims that Solomon's temple would be the site of the next prophet's heavenly ascension. The author points out that after the temple's destruction, the rock was rediscovered by the Caliph Umar. The lost signs were then reinstalled in their appointed places in Umayyad times during the construction of the Dome of the Rock and the Aqsa Mosque, and not a word about Abd al Malik. And 1483, the first Western writer who provides for a vague description of the Dome of the Rock after the Crusades is the German traveller Bernhard von Bradenbach. He visits the Dome of the Rock in 1483. So again, we can see that onion-shaped roof, which is consistent with the other image. Bradenbach travels with Bernhard Ruwick, who is the designer of the book's fold-out woodcuts. In the detail of his account, the onion-shaped dome with its access hatch missing in Van Eyck's painting, as well as the octagonal drum, stand out. Okay. So we see an octagonal to circular drum dilemma. How does one transfer mosaics from an octagonal drum onto a circular drum without destroying them? So if there are mosaics on that drum at that time, and we have a circular drum, which we do today, then you have to destroy those mosaics to transfer them. So you essentially have to reconstruct those mosaics. So you can't say that they are exactly what they were before. It's more likely that the mosaics were done afresh and probably a new design created at a later time when the circular drum was done. Now, each side of the drum is supported by a strong pillar, 5 of which are visible and has 2 windows. The main building can otherwise be recognized as it stands today, although it has 6 openings per side. In the modern version, the cupola is held up by 4 pillars and a circular drum, and the main building has 7 arched openings per side. 1483 AD, Felix Fabry. Just a little later, the German Felix Fabry is able to visit the Dome of the Rock. That he does not see or recognize an Arab inscription is made clear by his attribution of the original structure to Umar. So it's Umar once again. Again, this is all consistent with the idea that there is no inscription, because they can't make up their mind. Is it Umar? Is it Abd al Malik? Is it al-Mamun? Is it Walid? He goes on to describe cherubim on the mosaics. This is witnessed in 1483. His description includes a magnificent mosaic decoration upon a gold ground on the upper half of the outer walls that are in the forms of trees, palms, and olive trees, and the figures of the cherubim, for they do not suffer other images or lifelike structures. The problem is that cherubim are not part of the modern mosaics. This is further evidence that things have changed quite dramatically since then. In the late 15th century, there are no inscriptions mentioned. Mosaic features were different. So there's more evidence here. Also from the end of the 15th century, Butshir Ed-Din writes that the interior and exterior walls of the Dome of the Rock were decorated with colourful mosaics even up high. But like Fabry before, he neither gives us the builder nor the inscriptions. Around the same time, Al-Samhudi claims that mosaics from the time of the Umayyads were made according to the picture of the Tree of Paradise and its palaces. He tells us enough that we can be sure that he does not talk about the present mosaics. There are no palaces in the mosaics, and no modern visitor would describe the extant mosaic's primary feature as colourful. While internal decorations on ceiling and walls seem to be of Mamluk origin, the defeated Caliph Al-Mutawakkil III formally transfers the religious leadership over all Muslims to Sultan Salim I in 1516, 1517. This transfer includes sovereignty over the holiest cities of Islam, Mecca and Jerusalem. Salim expresses his awareness that he is now the possessor of the first Qibla. Despite its apparent significance, other than enabling Jews to move freely to Jerusalem and fulfilling a critical component of end-time prophecy, not much changes on the Temple Mount at first. And then we get this. A pilgrimage certificate from 1544 shows a layout of the Haram al-Sharif with the Dome of the Rock covering the foundation stone. So why is this of significance? It seems to be the interior of the dome or a composite. If this is what it appears to be, then we look at a first representation of the interior mosaics on the inner octagonal. Despite the artistic difference in hue, the relationship between the extant mosaics and the art on the drawing seems to be apparent. So all of a sudden, we get our first clear reference to the mosaics in the Dome of the Rock as they exist today. And as I say, the only difference is in the hue or the colour. That this first shows up here cannot be an accident. While the mosaics have never been mentioned before in any recognisable form, they probably existed in the year 1544, 1545 as a template for an artistic pilgrimage certificate. Next, AJ Deus outlines what he believes led to the polemical inscriptions that focus mostly upon Jesus. So this is a bit speculative, and you're left really to make your own mind on this one, whether you buy his description of what happened. But here it is in any case. Suleiman named his son Mehmed, the Turkish form of Muhammad. This was not merely fate. According to apocalyptic Ottoman beliefs at the time, a young man by the name of Muhammad would be ruler during end times. His true objective was to capture Rome and all the lands of the Blonde peoples in a holy war, meaning the realms of Constantinople, Vienna and Rome proper. Although this belief had been used to legitimize an earlier Ottoman ruler, Suleiman renewed the projection of apocalyptic prophecy not only onto his son, but also onto himself. He styled himself as the new Solomon. Such a claim should not only alarm every Muslim for its apparent heretical stance, but also every researcher in the field. The apocalypse constitutes the end of prophecy and a new beginning under a new covenant, which also means a new religion. What was Suleiman trying to pull off? To add to the complication, we have a figure called David Roubini, who announces his messianic mission. According to church records, he is David al-Nazarani Abbasasieh, the Hebrew king of Ethiopia, Dawit II of the Solomonic dynasty. The Pope gets to know him as Dawit and Prester John, not as a Jewish Messiah Roubini. He is the forerunner to Shlomo Malko, the two forming a messianic pair. Roubini arrives in Jerusalem in 1523. In a conversation that takes place in Gaza, he announces his messianic mission. The end of the world is near. The evil ones would be brought down to earth and Jews would be uplifted. War would come between the world powers. Roubini introduces himself to the guards of the Temple Mount as the son of Prophet Muhammad and the new Lord of the Muslims. Of course, since any Messiah must be from a branch of the houses of David or Joseph, Roubini and Prophet Muhammad must have been in one of the two houses. The 70 elders also come to Jerusalem to join in the preparations for the end of the world and for the sack of the temple. They reinstate the Sanhedrin. So here we find hints of what is behind the inscriptional message as we find it today. AJ Deus says, at this junction, a scholar by the name of Mullah Kabiz appears in Constantinople, an obvious nickname of contempt. The scholar merely fits a rabbinic pattern where Kabiz stands for the lineage of King David and Mullah for a messianic figure. In a near contemporary history, he is called Mulkarabum, or Mulka the Arab, whom I have already introduced. This man is highly esteemed in Constantinople as the Prophet of Damascus, and he is promoted by Grand Vizier Ibrahim Pasha, Suleiman's right hand. Since the recent converts from Orthodox Christianity to Sunni Islam are open to new ideas, he proposes a new religion where Jesus enjoyed supremacy over Prophet Muhammad and all other prophets. Mullah Qapis's proposal is the apparent result of a fusion of Byzantine and Islamic apocalyptic thinking. I wonder how that went down. AJ Deus goes on to describe what happened next. He says, as I've shown with the inscriptions in Islam, Muhammad is merely the prophet, while the Quran singles out Jesus as the Messiah with a hotline to his God. Jesus is the Christ Messiah of Christianity and of Islam. The Quran puts the word of God on Jesus Christ through his mother, the Virgin Mary, and on Prophet Muhammad after the day of Hunayn. To cut the legends short, a tribunal fails to refute Mullah Qapis's arguments and releases him. Allegedly, he had challenged Suleiman's position as the shadow of God on earth, meaning that the Sultan pretends to be the only intercessor appointed by his God. So, according to the legend, the tribunal fails to refute Mullah Qapis's arguments, but AJ Deus would say actually there is a refutation of his arguments, and where do you find them? But in the inscriptions themselves inside the Dome of the Rock. So he would argue that the inscriptions are a response to Mullah Qapis's ideas in the 16th century, not to Byzantine Christianity of the 7th century. Together with the proposal for a new religion, this puts Mullah Qapis solidly into Messianic territory. We do not have enough information about this Mullah Cherubim, but his death was likely an invention on the path to Messianic immortality. But what we do have is the element that is sticking out from the inscriptions, the simultaneous diminishing and lifting of Jesus, not to a higher level, but to the same level as Prophet Muhammad, an apparent compromise between Cherubim's proposal and the Ottoman naysayers. It is said that Mullah's positions have never been refuted by Muslim scholars, but the clarification, the refutation, hangs on the inner octagonal of the Dome of the Rock. And we also, at that time, have a 1528 AD inscription which prays for Suleiman. The windows up high in the dome are decorated with a long inscription that prays for Suleiman and is dated to 1528. If authentic, then internal and external renovations must be ongoing during the Sanhedrin's presence on the Temple Mount. Now, I've no way of knowing if AJ Deus is merely speculating about this idea of a Sanhedrin assembling in Jerusalem, so that requires confirmation, but we'll take it on face value at the moment. In 1543, Suleiman's son Mahmud dies. This marks the point from which the Muslim caliph turns inwards to spirituality. For whichever reason, the Sanhedrin is said to have moved from Jerusalem to Safed sometime around 1542, but more likely after Mahmud's unexpected end. It would have given them 2 decades, from 1523 to 1543, for extensive interior renovations of the Dome of the Rock. And immediately thereafter we have the pilgrimage certificate from 1544, the one that we showed you earlier. Okay. From 1545 to 1566, the Dome of the Rock undergoes a significant restoration, during which today's exterior mosaics are attached in a mixture of Mamluk traditions and Ottoman ceramic techniques. During these renovations, the mosaics on the dome are allegedly replaced with glazed tiles. On the one hand, this is credible. On the other, the drum is still octagonal. Hence, we may discuss evidence that no longer exists. So, as we mentioned a number of times at this stage, because the drum is no longer octagonal today, whatever that was placed on the drum at that time no longer exists. It had to be replaced since then with something else. We also have this, the Mausoleum of Suleiman, from 1566-1567. It's clearly inspired by the Dome of the Rock, or by Von Raphael's version of it, as if the ruler intended to be laid to rest in the centre of the world, which is quite remarkable that the Dome of the Rock had such a significance for Suleiman. AJ Deus points out the similarity in style between the mosaics in the Dome of the Rock and in the tiles in Suleiman's mausoleum. Is that just a coincidence? He says the intricate decoration in Suleiman's mausoleum is geometrical. The closest that its designs get to an embedded message is a turban-like crown that is designed into the tiles over doorways adjacent to the mihrab. If the mosaics in the Dome of the Rock and the tiles in Suleiman's mausoleum are from the same period, then the difference is that the latter is of contemporary concern, while the former pretends to be of ancient origin. This is different with exterior tilework at the tomb of Selim II. Here we have a direct stylistic relationship to the figures in the Dome of the Rock. So what we're dealing with here is a pair of very similar mosaics that were probably created at the same time. Again, we have more evidence that the octagonal drum is still there. Being a disciple of Elia Levita, Sebastian Münster was a highly educated Jew and a later supporter of Lutheranism. He publishes the first German geographical description of the world in 1526, which contains a detailed history of Jerusalem and its temple from its biblical beginnings. In it, he also attributes the Dome of the Rock to Umar, then believed to be the original structure called Temple of Solomon. Okay, so we're back to Umar being the maker, the builder of the Dome of the Rock again. 1552, another contemporary woodcut of Jerusalem is included in Sebastian Münster's Latin version of his cosmography. The octagonal drum of the Dome of the Rock appears scaffolded as though under construction. I suggest it is primary evidence for the ongoing external decorations, and you can see it there. There are the scaffolding. Now, AJ Deus's inference is backed up by evidence of how the Dome of the Rock subsequently changes its appearance. In 1574 AD, the geographer Georges Brun of Cologne publishes his Théâtre des Cités du Monde. The drawing is an overview of Jerusalem which renders details very small. Regardless, the Dome of the Rock is recognizable with an octagonal main building and drum. The roof cupola appears a little different, as though the onion-shaped top was missing and was replaced with spire. And then in 1576 we have this. At the time of the drawing, the dome was octagonal with 2 stories of window openings. Remembering the scaffold image from immediately before that time, it appears that the cupola had been raised, giving the building a more pleasing aspect ratio. So we can see that just above the main roof, just below the cupola, you can see that there's 2 stories. So they've raised it up to make it look a little bit more aesthetically pleasing. Now, there's a series of evidence given by AJ Deus that around this time there's a concerted effort to keep prying eyes out of the Dome of the Rock. Why are they so keen at this stage, at this time, not to have outsiders seeing what was going on inside the Dome of the Rock? I suppose you could say, well, we're being paranoid here, but in order to create mosaics that claim to be, and inscriptions that claim to be from an earlier time, they first of all have to complete them without anyone seeing you working on them. So that's kind of like a precondition to pull this one off. Published in 1617, Fiennes Morrison reports on his 10-year travels. After expressing his horror about the circumstances of Jerusalem, which he visited in 1596, the book contains an expansive description of Jerusalem and the Temple Mount. He notes that the Dome of the Rock is shut. And I'll just share with you what he said about it. In this large circuit, compassed all with walls of old, the Temple of Solomon stood. At this time it was overgrown with grass, and in the midst thereof the Turks had a mosque for their wicked worship of Muhammad. Neither may any Christian come within this circuit, much less into the mosque, either being a capital offence, which they say some curious Christians had tried with loss of life, after they had been drawn to enter into it by some Turks' vain promises. Okay, so they were taking any look inside very seriously indeed. What have they got to hide? And again, there's a local report that Umar built the Dome of the Rock again. Morrison's publications contain crude miniature drawings of the site and building from his hand. It shows an octagonal drum that again appears to be raised. The great traveller Seigneur Jacques de Villemont visits Jerusalem around this time. His book Voyage is published in 1596 and an updated version in 1602. Like all other visitors, he is told that the structure stands as Umar had built it. Even locals do not seem to have a concept of Abd Al Malik. Muslim visitors appear to not have noted Al Malik's or Al Mamun's dedicatory inscription. So this is very late, 1602, and there doesn't seem to be those inscriptions yet. Villemont's eyewitness account of how the Dome of the Rock appeared during his visit is inspiring. His introduction to the building starts with remarks about the strictly enforced prohibition for Christians to enter. He tells a story of human curiosity by a Greek traveller who took the risk upon himself to sneak inside, and he gives his account there of it, okay, which you can have a read, but there's no mention of an inscription. There is no mention of Abd Al Malik's name or Al Mamun's in what he tells us. So we basically have a blank again. As AJ Deus summarizes it, however, because he mentions neither inscriptions nor subjects of the mosaics, we still cannot be satisfied whether he saw mosaics in the present state, part of it, or something different altogether. So no inscriptions, and nothing sufficient to indicate that he's looking at the same mosaics as we view today. Now, we have a travel report by Henri Castella from 1600 AD, which contains Morrison's woodcut. The former seems to have beaten the latter to print. He too confirms that the Dome of the Rock could not be visited under threat of death. So I think that's fairly solidly confirmed. Even though he tried to steal a look inside however he could, while he describes the tiled exterior and its luminous appearance in the sun in detail, he does not tell us about the drum. So AJ Deus says, we need to imagine there is an ancient inscription inside the Dome of the Rock that is squarely directed against Christianity. It is literally addressed to them, so they could read it and at once be convinced by its aggressive undertone. Muslims do not need education by these inscriptions. They do not believe in the heretical ideas the text frets about, and yet Christians who wanted to see it were faced with death if they dared to see it without prior conversion to Islam. And AJ Deus says only a religious mind could come up with that sort of logic unless there was something to hide. So why would you have a notice and then not allow the people that it's directed at to see it? That doesn't make sense, unless the only logical explanation is simply because there's something going on in there that they don't want people to see at that time. Now, we have something quite incredible. Henri Baron de Bovo visits the Dome of the Rock sometime before 1609 AD, when his travel journal is published. He had hired a Muslim to take measurements and describe the interior for him. He reports that the inside of the Dome of the Rock is now all white, with the exception of remnants of mosaics from old times. We do not know whether the Muslim scout fed Bovo with reliable information on what exactly was white, but old mosaics were inside, likely worked on. So it seems like this was a work in progress. If you were doing anything with the interior, you would probably create a blank canvas and then work on top of that. But we don't know if the report was truthful or not. I suppose that's probably the best we can say at this stage. How could a custodian of the Holy Sepulchre be unaware of an inscription said to say Abd Al Malik Al Mamun were the builder? So 1608, the custodian of the Holy Sepulchre delivers a 700-page overview of Jerusalem, its environs and sites, and he claims it was built by Umar. So this is literally just over 400 years ago, and yet still claimed to be built by Umar. How can Umar still be referred to as the builder if the inscription existed back then? George Sandys, A Relation of a Journey Begun AD 1610, contains an overview of Jerusalem with the very small detail of the Dome of the Rock labelled a mosque where stood the Temple of Solomon. And a quote here from it: "But who built this that now stands is doubtful. Some do attribute it to the Christians, others to a prince of the Arabians, which is confirmed by the Christians of these countries. And he, the Saracen Omar, the next successor unto Muhammad. Seated it is upon Mount Moriah in the southeast corner of the city, without doubt, in the very place where Solomon's stood, the more eminent building consisting of an 8 square round of bluish stone adorned with adjoining pillars and terraced above. In the midst of the shelving roof another upright aspired, though less by far, yet the same in form and substance, with the former being covered over with a cupola of lead." Even that late, the author's inquiry did not lead to Al Malik as the builder, and the drum was still octagonal. Umar was presented as the direct successor of Prophet Muhammad. So there's clearly a lot of confusion still as late as 1610. There doesn't seem to be a clear idea who the builder was. Some say it's Christians, some say it's Umar, but no reference to Abd Al Malik or Al Mamun. 1620, again, evidence for an octagonal drum, and again Umar is claimed as the builder. The Italian Bernardino Amico published his book about sacred architecture in 1620. His interest is on Christian sites, and he does not spend much time with the Temple Mount, mainly because he again could only visit it under threat of conversion or death. His crude drawing leaves much to desire, but a separate drawing shows that the drum was still octagonal. Like every other visitor before him, he was told that Umar was the builder. Yet Amico says something that nobody else mentioned before. Large dedicatory inscriptions of very old were mounted inside and out, attesting to the builder, Umar. So there's now inscriptions. No one has mentioned these before, so these must be relatively new. And they're presumably trying to sort out the confusion about who built the Dome of the Rock. Now they're claiming Umar is the one who built it. We have a travel report from 1700. Again, we see evidence that the drum is still octagonal. Now we also see evidence from the 1720s, 1730s of materials being used for the Dome of the Rock, which would be consistent with making tiles. AJ Deus says that extensive restorations for the Dome of the Rock are ordered by Ahmed III from 1720 onwards. The documents in a register in the Prime Ministry archives in Istanbul includes orders, accounts and inventories that are dated between 1720 and 1736. That high-profile superintendents of construction are put in charge indicates the importance that the Jerusalem project was given. The extensive list of material includes pigments for paintings and raw materials for the local production of tiles, but no tile makers appear on the list. It does not tell us what exactly was restored or renovated, despite the fact that its costs were monumental. Suspicious. Richard Pocock published an eyewitness account in a description of the East in 1745, which contains a section about Jerusalem and the Dome of the Rock. He appears to be the first to put down an architectural plan of the exterior of the building, which he describes as of mainly green tiles. Does that sound like the Dome of the Rock today? Certainly I haven't seen green tiles on the outside, so that indicates the tiles out on the outside are from after this time frame. Elzerius Horn was custodian of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem between 1725 and 1726, and secretary of the convent Sant Salvatorius between 1737 and 1738. His book with drawings of holy edifices is published in 1744. Horn's design shows something strikingly new, the drum in its modern form, as you can see there on the right. That the change must have been recent can be taken from an overview of Jerusalem inside the same book. There the drum was still octagonal. The cupola must have been replaced, so around this time we have the change in the drum from octagonal to circular. So now we can pinpoint when that happened, which means any mosaics, any inscriptions that may be on the drum or even on the dome would have happened at that time. The contemporary primary evidence leaves no wriggle room. The replacement of the drum was commissioned in 1720 by Ahmed III and completed by Mahmud I, 1730 to 1754, no later than 1744 AD. Horn was custodian of the Holy Sepulchre, as we saw, between 1725 and 1726. He did not only deliver designs of a new drum that have been imprinted in countless academic articles, but also a dedicatory inscription, one that only comes as a surprise to those who have not paid attention, that was overlooked by the same academics. It means nothing less than that the correction of Al Malik's signature to Al Mamun was not there in the early 18th century. Now we also know that not long before, Al Malik's signature was not there either. It must have originated in the 1520s and 30s with Umar's signature. Okay, so we have Umar's signature, and then it became Al Malik's, and then it became Al Mamun. So there's a lot of messing around with inscriptions here. But they obviously couldn't decide who to make the builder of the Dome of the Rock. Now, according to detailed architectural drawings undertaken by Ernest Tatum Richmond around 1920, the modern drum is circular. There is no viable case to be made how mosaics and inscriptions from the previously octagonal drum could have survived. We can now confidently dismiss all mosaics and inscriptions on the drum and dome as 18th century works, fabrications, and fraudulent pretensions. The dedicatory inscription and its adjoining mosaics on the octagonal arcade leave us with few and precise choices within a fairly short period of time during the 16th and 17th centuries, Messianic Jews and Suleiman's successors. Now, given the pilgrimage certificate from 1544 to 1545, the Jewish Serpent King, which is that elaborate design that we saw earlier in the presentation, and his royal brother designs on the inner octagonal find their origin then between 1523 and 1543. The inscription is from the same time, but it must have sported Umar. Okay. Abd Al Malik's dedication is a likely cover-up executed between 1720 and 1744 AD that must have replaced the dedication by Umar from the Serpent King. Al Mamun's correction is from the 18th or 19th century, so we're talking very recent indeed. And now some additional pieces of information and evidence. 1804, we see at last evidence of the round drum. This is Luigi Mayer's view of Jerusalem from the Mount of Olives, and you can see the round drum there, but an elongated cupola. Okay, it looks remarkably like an acorn, as I would put it. And then we find the following. Another major restoration is undertaken under Sultan Mahmud II in 1817. The marble of the exterior of the building is restored and a portico over the south Qibla entrance is built. Yet another significant change to the structure appears to have occurred: the cupola. Drawings with mosaics of the dome were made by Frederick Catherwood in 1833. His drawings include an outside view and a cross-section together with a layout of the mosaics in question. This is the first primary evidence that mosaics on the drum exist. Okay, now we know the mosaics in the drum and Al-Mamun's correction originate in 1817 and were completed before 1833. Okay. William Leighton Lake's steel engraving from 1841 clearly shows the round drum of the Dome of the Rock and the new cupola. 1 year later, the artist David Roberts draws the Mosque of Umar. We have this 1842 photo. Again, we can see it pretty much as it is today. Here's a photograph from 1862. Now, just bear in mind that only 30 years before, they had already put tile work on the outside. Already, we see there's exterior tile work that is mainly missing. So I don't know how it's in such a shabby state only 30 years later. That seems to be a bit of a mystery. And so, to kind of summarize, the Dome of the Rock 7 holes. So what were they? Our earliest reference to a Dome of the Rock, i.e. a dome over the Temple Mount foundation rock, is in the late 9th century. We've shown that. Our earliest verifiable witness to the Dome of the Rock mosaics and the inner arcade inscriptions as they exist today is 1523 to 1543 AD. In other words, incredibly late, only 500 years old. Number 3, the earliest witness inscription as to who built the dome was from the same period, 1523, 1543, except it claims to be built by Umar. And then the earliest verifiable date for the creation of the Abd Al Malik inscription is 1720, 1744 AD. The complete rebuilding of the drum from the ground up, from octagonal to circular, mid-18th century. The mosaics and inscriptions on the drum and dome are 18th century creations. And lastly, the earliest verifiable date for the creation of Al-Mamun correction is sometime between 1817 and 1833 AD. Were the mosaics and inscriptions from the time of Abd Al Malik? Well, based on the extensive evidence presented by AJ Deus, I am persuaded that they weren't. In fact, I am thoroughly convinced they weren't. The implications of this are huge. If something so concrete and visible as a building can have its story distorted over the centuries, then what about something as elusive as a figure called Muhammad? If you liked this video, please hit the like. I'd really appreciate that. Thank you. If you don't want to miss any future videos and you want to see new guests appear on my channel, please don't forget to hit the subscribe button so you won't miss that content. Thank you for watching.